Tonight, the shelves feel taller. That is not, strictly speaking, possible. Stone keeps its measurements better than memory does, and these hidden stacks have not grown merely because I dislike what waits in the lesson ahead. Yet there are nights when vertical things seem to lengthen. Candle flames draw thin. Shadows climb. The uppermost shelves disappear into a dimness that feels less like architecture than judgment. One begins to understand why so many old temples preferred height. When power wishes to remind mortals of scale, it reaches upward. On the desk before me rests a prayer book whose clasp has been torn away. A small bronze scale missing one pan, and a piece of blackened glass that was once smooth enough to reflect a face, and now reflects only light badly. None of them, taken alone, is especially eloquent. Together they say what the city above us rarely bothers to say until it is too late. Order is not the same thing as permanence. Faith is not the same thing as safety. And when the apparatus by which a world explains itself begins to fail, everyone suddenly remembers how much of ordinary life depended upon things they had called eternal, only because they had not yet seen them break. Above our heads, Waterdeep behaves with its usual civic confidence. A door bangs in some alley where a debtor has once again mistaken speed for strategy. Late wagons grind over wet stone. Somewhere along the harbour, a sailor is making a theological claim with the aid of too much ale and not enough evidence. Somewhere in a noble villa, an old lineage is still reciting itself in the belief that ancestry can substitute for moral effort. Somewhere, a priest assures a frightened petitioner that the gods are just, by which he usually means that he hopes they remain predictable for another week. That hope, as it happens, is tonight's subject. You have found your way once more to the Lich's tale, a Faerûn Lorecast. I am Irillian Cantonine, Baelnorn, Lore Warden, custodian of overlong memory, and one of the last beings under this city with both the leisure and the temperament to distrust any history that arrives too neatly arranged. I keep these lessons because the living are forever trying to turn catastrophe into anecdote. They remember the names that glitter and misplace the systems that made those names dangerous. They remember the duel and forget the grain price. They remember the fallen god and forget the street where divine magic ceased and 10,000 ordinary conclusions had to be revised before dusk. I remain because someone should object when memory starts flattering power instead of examining it. Last time we spoke of factions without borders. We examined the Harpers, the Gentarim, and the Red Wizards of Thay as what I called immortal nations. Portable sovereignties of intent, organizations that survive the loss of walls because they are built from roots, loyalties, methods, coffers, passwords, and ideas about how the world ought to be arranged. We asked how they recruit, how they finance themselves, how they endure the death of leaders who would have been terminal to a kingdom, and why they keep returning in later Faerûn with all the persistence of mold in a damp archive. Tonight, we discover what becomes of such organizations when the highest imaginable authority descends into weather. Tonight, we enter 1358 DR, the Year of Shadows, the time of troubles. The gods fall like meteors, and everyone discovers what part of their life had been balanced, buffered, legitimized, restrained, or merely made tolerable by divine distance. This is not only a tale about heaven punishing heaven. That summary is popular because it is brief and can be shouted over tavern noise. It is also inadequate. The time of troubles is one of those great Faerûnian hinge years in which theology stops being a category and becomes geography. Priests find that devotion no longer reaches upward in the accustomed way. Wizards learn that arcane practice too can become unstable when the great custodial structure above it is wounded. Merchants discover that roads feel different when gods themselves are rumored to be walking them. Kings, guildmasters, hedge priests, sellswords, sailors, drow matriarchs, dwarven defenders, harper agents, banite officers, red wizard schemers, and frightened peasants all receive the same brutal instruction at different hours. Do not confuse dependence with order. That will be our thesis, my apprentice. We will of course follow the great divine convulsion itself, Ao, the tablets of fate, Helm upon the celestial stair, Mystra's fall, the wandering avatars, the deaths of old gods, the rise of new powers, and the dreadful joke by which mortals like Cyric climb into heaven through a staircase built from opportunism, corpses, and the temporary collapse of moral standards above. But we will do more than that. We will walk the ground. We will ask what was happening among the great factions and peoples while the heavens were under audit. What were the harpers doing while gods bled? What did the Gentarim become when their patron could fall from the sky onto his own altar? How did the red wizards read a crisis that struck divine states harder than magocratic ones? What did 1358 mean to Mulhorand and Unther, to the Mulan peoples whose history had been tied to manifest divinity since the breaking of Imaskar? What did dwarves, drow, merchants, and city dwellers learn when miracles became local, unstable, or suddenly absent? For if you wish to understand why later Faerûn distrusts prophets, fears overmighty portfolios, speaks Ao's name with either awe or irritation, and never quite recovers its old innocence regarding the traffic between mortal ambition and divine office, you must not study only the gods. You must study the people who were forced to keep living while the gods made a constitutional crisis of the sky. Before we begin, a word from the sensible mortals who continue, with a blend of courage and market awareness I choose to respect, to support an undead archive project about why civilizations break. This episode is brought to you by Dharma Web Solutions, builders of websites, systems, and digital structures meant to survive contact with real users, real change, and the occasional ugly surprise from reality. If you need front-end work with clarity, back-end work with rigor, or the difficult connective craft that keeps a whole technical system from degenerating into feuding parts, visit dharmawebsolutions.com. They build the way any responsible temple quartermaster or half-competent royal archivist ought to have planned for crisis, assuming that maintenance is not the embarrassing sequel to Vision, but the proof that Vision respected the world enough to last. Now then, set the prayer book aside. Leave the broken scale where you can still see it. We are going to speak of judgment, and I would rather not let the symbols become too subtle. Most tellings begin, as they should, with the theft of the tablets of fate. These artifacts are easy to describe badly and worth describing carefully. They were not merely holy property, nor decorative affirmations of celestial bureaucracy, nor trophies to be stolen, because gods, like kings, are never as immune to vanity as their liturgies insist. The tablets were bound up with order itself. In old accountings, they recorded the names and duties of powers, and stood as part of the balancing architecture by which cosmic roles, obligations, and boundaries remained intelligible. Some traditions also hold that the tablets helped maintain the separation between Aber and Toril, which is to say that even their theft touched more than divine prestige. They belonged to the constitutional framework of the world. And like many constitutional frameworks, they were most appreciated after they failed. The gods, needless to say, did not shine in this episode. The theft is chiefly laid at the feet of Bane and Merkul, though the exact distribution of initiative interests chroniclers far more than it should. Ambitious powers do not act in a vacuum. They act in systems already weakened by entitlement. Eo's wrath falls not only because the tablets are taken, but because the gods as a class have grown negligent toward the duties assigned to them. They have become possessive of office and lax in obligation, attentive to rivalry and prestige, while forgetting that portfolios are not private ornaments. A god station is not owned, it is held in trust. That last distinction matters so much that the whole age may be read as its enforcement. Eo over God stands awkwardly in mortal understanding because mortals are forever trying to sort every power into categories they already know. They want a father, a king, a lawgiver, a creator, a tyrant, a distant clockmaker, or at least a recognizable type of priestly superior. Ao is inconvenient to all those simplifications. He is not worshipped in the manner of ordinary gods. He does not trade favors for devotion because that is not his office. He is better understood as custodian, adjudicator, and guarantor of cosmic order at the highest level available to the setting. He is the one who asks whether the system is functioning according to the duties embedded in it. When the answer is no, his interventions are not pastoral. They are corrective. Some later believers find that cold. Archives call it legible. When the gods cannot or will not properly answer for the disappearance of the tablets, Ao does not soothe, negotiate, or invite a committee of self-exculpation. He casts them down to Toril in mortal avatar forms, all save Helm, who is left at his post to guard the celestial stair and bar return. Consider the severity of that choice. Ao does not merely punish, he localizes divinity. He forces gods into embodiment, vulnerability, movement, logistics, and consequence. They become, for a time, creatures who must occupy roads, cities, battlefields, temples, river crossings, wilderness shrines, and frightened crowds. The heavens cease being remote enough to protect themselves from reportage. And because gods are not cast down into an empty laboratory but into Faerûn, the result is not abstract philosophy. It is a continental emergency. Priests discover first how material theology has become. Divine magic no longer moves with accustomed reliability through the usual channels. In many cases, the great miracles of a faith cannot be invoked unless the priest is physically near the avatar of the deity served. Think on that. Not merely faithful, near. 1 mile is the measure given in some records, which means that for countless communities, the relationship between temple and god suddenly becomes a matter of literal distance on a roadmap. Whole clerical hierarchies, previously organized around doctrine, rite, prestige, and patrimony, must now ask a far more humiliating question. Where exactly is our God? A village shrine may remain sincere and useless. A great urban temple may keep its gold, its choir, its relics, and its political influence, yet be unable to provide the sort of aid it once considered routine. Healing becomes irregular. High blessings falter. Protective workings fail or arrive thinly. Omens grow contradictory. Processions turn into search parties. Pilgrimage ceases to be a pious supplement and becomes, in some faiths, operational necessity. The spiritual map becomes physical in the crudest possible way. The effect on morale is difficult to overstate. To the pious, it feels like abandonment even when doctrine insists otherwise. To the cynical, it looks like exposure. To rulers who depended on temple legitimacy, it is a very expensive afternoon. Arcane magic fares no better once Mystra's condition worsens. This too is often misunderstood because tavern retellings love a bright division between priests and wizards, as though the gods suffer one sort of crisis and mages another, separate and cleaner. Faerûn is seldom so obliging. Magic in the realms is structured, regulated, filtered, and made usable through arrangements larger than any individual practitioner. Mystra's role in relation to the weave means that divine constitutional failure quickly becomes arcane instability as well. Spellcasters discover unpredictability where procedure once stood. Experiments become riskier. Battle magic becomes less trustworthy. The invisible confidence that had underwritten educated spell use begins to fray. A continent accustomed to living amid magic finds that magic can suddenly feel like weather. Again, do not imagine only archmages. Imagine locksmith charms failing. Imagine wards behaving strangely. Imagine caravan masters who once hired a lowly hedge wizard for predictable protections, now wondering whether a goblet will light itself on fire because a goddess has been wounded 300 miles away. Imagine the common mind of Faerûn trying to absorb the fact that if the gods can be displaced from office, perhaps every hierarchy is more provisional than advertised. That, incidentally, is one reason the time of troubles matters so much to later politics. It is not merely that gods die. It is that metaphysical incumbency loses its aura of inevitability. And once a world learns that office can be vacated, stolen, shattered, reassigned, or disastrously inherited, it never again regards priests, prophecies, and grand claims of mandate in quite the same way. Io intended correction among the gods. What Faerûn received was an education in contingency. Let us stay for a while with the ground rather than rushing upward after avatars and battles. Great crises are always narrated from above first. Kings, gods, named villains, named saviors. Even scholars who know better are tempted by altitude. Yet the true measure of a hinge year lies lower down, in the adjustments ordinary institutions are forced to make before they have vocabulary for the event reshaping them. Consider the temple quarter of any middling Faerûnian city in 1358. At dawn, the bells ring because bells are easier to continue than to interpret. Supplicants arrive. Sick children are brought in. Merchants come to have contracts blessed. Guards request small protections before patrol. Widows ask whether their dead are safe. Guildmasters seek favorable omens, and the clergy, who in more ordinary years would have met such needs with practiced gradations of certainty, must now distinguish between what remains possible, what has become uncertain, and what has failed entirely. Some try honesty and lose authority for it. Some try performance and lose more later. Some send runners to neighboring shrines in the hope that another branch of the same faith has heard where the avatar was last seen. Some become more rigid precisely because rigidity is the cheapest imitation of confidence. In such conditions, doctrinal disputes, which once would have taken decades to mature, can ripen into schism in a week. Who speaks for a god absent from the customary channels? The senior priest, whose rank is inherited through temple custom? The visionary who claims a dream location for the avatar? The militant who says doctrine now requires armed pilgrimage? The humble local cleric who admits uncertainty and stays to feed the poor rather than chase rumor across the countryside? The time of troubles is full of divine drama, yes. It is also full of administrative panic disguised as piety. Now look to the markets. Faith in Faerûn is not a private sentiment. It attaches itself to trade, contracts, sea voyages, planting, healing, inheritance, weather law, and the innumerable little negotiations by which people make risk bearable. If temples cannot promise what they promised last month, then lenders revise terms, caravan masters hesitate, ship captains seek extra auspices, insurers grow creative, and rumor acquires exchange value. A merchant house that hears Warkeen's clergy are faltering does not respond with philosophical melancholy. It responds by recalculating credit, storage, and trust. The respectable economy becomes more expensive precisely because metaphysical predictability had been part of its hidden infrastructure. This is why apocalypses are always inflationary. Even when no one says so poetically, armies feel it too. Soldiers are a practical people when allowed to be. They want reliable command, food that remains food, healers who can heal, and banners that mean what yesterday taught them the banners mean. During the time of troubles, martial religion becomes immediately tactical. Can the war priest still mend the wounded? Is the enemy's patron present nearby? Will the chaplain's blessing hold through the charge, or is the god 50 miles south walking through some entirely different scandal? Any force accustomed to divine support must now think like logisticians of sanctity. A campaign may hinge not on courage alone, but on whether a deity's avatar can be reached, protected, interpreted, or exploited. Bandits, opportunists, false prophets, and local tyrants thrive in such weather. They always do. When the ordinary channels of legitimacy are disrupted, every loud fool with a painted sign and 3 armed cousins discovers a theology. Some proclaim the end of all former order. Some insist their village shrine has become uniquely favored. Some produce counterfeit relics. Some claim to have seen this or that god on the road and sell directions at a price. The gullible are cheated. The desperate are recruited. The truly frightened become cruel. A frightened crowd is one of the oldest engines of sudden orthodoxy in the world. And yet, to say all this is not to say the common folk simply collapse into chaos. That is aristocratic nonsense. Most people, even amid divine upheaval, do what people have always done when systems fail. They improvise. They lean harder on kin, guild, neighborhood, and local custom. They store grain if they can. They trust the healer who has helped before, even if the miracle now takes longer. They make saints of the reliable and skeptics of the flamboyant. They begin distinguishing, with a speed scholars rarely credit them for, between the priest who can still be useful, the priest who has become only ceremonial, and the priest whose certainty has turned feral. Crises do not only reveal institutions, they reveal character under institutional shortage. Waterdeep, Suzail, Athkatla, Scornable, Iriaibor, and the lesser towns between would all have felt this in their own idioms. Ports worry about weather and trade. Inland market towns worry about caravans, crop blessings, and roads suddenly filled with refugees or pilgrims. Frontier settlements worry about raids because raiders also hear stories and tend to infer, often correctly, that divine confusion means slower retaliation. Dwarven holds ask what obligations remain to old rites if the channels of divine practice alter. Drow cities with priestly structures watch for advantage whenever conventional sacred authority flickers. Wizards, never immune to professional vanity, begin telling one another that they expected instability all along, which is a lie, but a traditional one. A crisis of the heavens thus becomes a census of dependency. Who depended on certainty? Who depended on spectacle? Who depended on regular access to power they neither controlled nor fully understood? Who knew how to continue with less? These questions matter because the time of troubles is remembered by later ages not only through the famous deaths of gods, but through the smaller and more durable lesson it taught every level of society. Build nothing important on the assumption that the channel above you will always remain open. Faerûn, being Faerûn, learned that lesson incompletely. But it learned it enough to become more suspicious thereafter, which is, in historical terms, still a kind of progress. Now we may follow the great procession of divine humiliation itself. Au casts the gods down in Kithorn, and the world begins its long stagger. The deities, unaccustomed to confinement and proximity, do not all respond alike. Some cling to old duties as best they can. Some seek allies. Some seek the tablets above all else. Some take the opportunity to settle old scores with all the self-control of feuding nobles who have mistaken office for personality over several millennia. Helm alone remains at his post, fully empowered, guarding the way back. This detail has never ceased to trouble Faerûn, and rightly so. The god of guardianship, duty, and watchfulness obeys exactly when obedience makes him hated. He stands upon the celestial stair not as comforter, but as gate. It is a terrible kind of fidelity, and one of the purest examples in the realms of a god proving true to portfolio in a way mortals may find morally unbearable. Then Mystra comes. Her attempt to pass Helm is among the defining moments of the entire crisis because it joins theology, pride, urgency, law, and catastrophe in one blow. Whether you read her act as desperate necessity, overconfidence, or a tragic mixture of both, the result is the same. Helm bars the way. Mystra presses the issue. He slays her. The blast is felt across the realms, and the weave suffers with her. This is not merely the death of a deity. It is damage to the managerial structure of magic itself. Every wizard thereafter lives in the after-image of that moment, whether they know it or not. Helm is despised for it in many quarters, especially where people prefer mercy from their guardians to obedience. Yet from Ao's perspective, one suspects Helm is precisely the point. A system cannot be restored if every office holder decides that duty should bend whenever the office becomes personally inconvenient. Remember that when we return to Ao as judge. With Mystra fallen, arcane instability worsens. The crisis is now total enough that no educated person can pretend it concerns only temples and pilgrims. Meanwhile, the gods themselves spread across Faerûn in a pattern at once mythic and embarrassingly practical. Bane moves through conflict and command, drawing the faithful and the terrified. Mirkul advances with his own gruesome sense of inevitability. Baal stalks murder and opportunity. Torm, loyal even to the point of self-destruction, becomes the principal counterweight to Bane's theatre of force. Other deities fight, wander, bless, menace, or attempt to preserve fragments of their old responsibilities in increasingly broken conditions. The continent becomes crowded with avatars and rumors of avatars. Some reports are true, some are pious wish, some are opportunistic fraud. All of them matter because people act on what they think they have heard. Among the most consequential early struggles is Bane's movement against Shadowdale. That is not accidental. Shadowdale is one of those maddeningly strategic places where geography, history, local defiance, and the habit of attracting important people combine into a perpetual inconvenience for large-scale evil. Elminster is there, Mystra's interests are there, resistance networks intersect there. If you were a tyrannical deity with ambitions sharpened by humiliation, you would find the Dale difficult to ignore. Bane's contest there foreshadows a larger truth of the time of troubles. The gods do not descend into an apolitical landscape. They descend into already meaningful ground, where every road has alliances, every temple has enemies, and every move echoes through mortal systems. From Shadowdale, the crisis widens and travels. Midnight, Adon, Keelamvor, and Cyric become central, not because the cosmos has suddenly discovered a fondness for adventuring parties, but because history sometimes has the indecency to hinge on small groups who happen to keep moving when larger institutions freeze. Midnight, young, gifted, and increasingly entangled with the remnants of Mystra's essence, becomes a vessel for continuity no one would have trusted in quieter times. Adon, stripped and tested, represents faith under dislocation. Keelamvor, dour and wounded, provides the battered decency that apocalypse so rarely rewards. And Cyric, Cyric, provides the indispensable reminder that proximity to destiny is not the same thing as deserving it. Their path intersects with the tablets, with the Dead Three, and with one another's worst judgments. Betrayal, necessity, uneasy reunion, renewed treachery. The company's route through the crisis is less a heroic straight line than a moving argument about what sort of people catastrophe promotes. At Tantras, the argument becomes public thunder. There, Bane and Torm clash in one of the most famous divine combats in Faerûnian memory. The city becomes stage, altar, battlefield, and casualty all at once. Bane, empowered by sacrifice and swollen with tyrannical force, assaults the place and the stair itself. Torm meets him in the full, terrible dignity of obedient defense. Their battle is remembered for spectacle, and it deserves to be. Lightning, devastation, the sense that doctrine has taken on mass and is breaking masonry. Yet what matters most is the result. They destroy one another. Bane falls. Torm falls as well, his death later reversed by Ao, but in the immediate human experience, that nuance arrives far too late to help the dead in Tantras. This is one of the central truths of the time of troubles. Even when the righteous win, geography still pays. Bhaal's end is murkier in the public memory, which is fitting for a god of murder. He hunts Midnight and her companions, reveals paths only mortals can take, presses toward the tablets, and is eventually slain by Cyric with Godsbane, the blade that is not merely a blade. Sources differ on the exact day scribe should hang the event upon. The date is copied inconsistently. The lesson is not. Murder, opportunism, disguise, and ambition converge, and a petty mercenary proves entirely capable of killing a god when the structure above him has become sufficiently unstable. Do not romanticize that. There is a vulgar school of interpretation that treats Cyric's ascent as proof of mortal potential, as though the time of troubles were some liberating demonstration that anyone can rise. Anyone can, yes, in the sense that a building may collapse in any direction once its supports are removed. It is not therefore admirable. Mirkul's end is grander and somehow filthier. He brings death to the western cities, moves through plague, undead, and fear, and eventually reaches Waterdeep by way of the hidden darks beneath the yawning portal and the pool of loss. There the contest tightens around the reunited tablets, around Blackstaff Tower, around the practical need to prevent the Lord of Bones from reclaiming full leverage. Midnight, aided by allies including Elminster and Kelban, faces him in the skies over the city. She disintegrates him before he can reclaim the old order for himself. A cloud of brown pestilence falls over the streets below. Plants wither, people choke. Even the defeat of death arrives by spreading another kind of death first. Again, geography pays. Again, victory is never clean enough for the songs that follow it. By then, Kelemvor is dead, betrayed by Cyric. Adon has endured the stripping and reconstitution of faith. Midnight carries far more than one mortal frame should have been asked to carry. Cyric, meanwhile, has demonstrated what the time of troubles perhaps most unwillingly reveals: that the ladder between mortality and divinity can be climbed by the ruthless when systems of judgment are interrupted, and that office gained in chaos will still wound the world long after the emergency seems concluded. At last, the tablets are brought back to Ao, and here the story resists the most common mortal hope. One expects restoration, repair, the careful replacing of what was stolen, followed by a stern lecture and the resumption of ordinary cosmic service. Ao does not do that. He judges, he redistributes. He destroys the tablets rather than merely reinstalling them. The pantheon is rearranged. Mistra's office passes to Midnight, who becomes the new goddess of magic, Cyric receives vast and deeply alarming responsibility over portfolios once held by the Dead Three. The world does not return to what it was. It enters a new settlement born from failure. That is why 1358 DR begins the era of upheaval rather than ending with a tidy apology from heaven. The system is not patched. It is reset under indictment. Now let us turn the lens from gods to factions, beginning with the one most likely to object to being discussed under the same candle as Banites and Thaans. The Harpers entered the time of troubles with one great advantage and one equal liability. Their advantage was structural. Because the Harpers are not a kingdom, not a standing empire, and not even in the strongest sense a centralized order, they are unusually well suited to a year in which channels fail. They do not rely upon a single capital. They are accustomed to fragmentary intelligence, local initiative, improvisation, and the moral burden of acting without waiting for some clean vertical command. A Harper cell, deprived of a few leaders, can still send warnings, hide the vulnerable, escort messengers, gather rumor, and oppose tyranny in the practical grammar of roads and safe houses. In a crisis that confuses formal institutions, the Harpers look almost prophetic simply because they were already built like a response network. Their liability is moral and epistemic. A decentralized order lives and dies by judgment. When the heavens become uncertain and rumors of divine presence multiply, judgment becomes very expensive. Whom do you trust? Which report is true? Which apparition is a god? A sorcerous deception, a panicked embellishment, or a fiend cleverly exploiting the religious weather? The Harpers are strong in mobility, but vulnerable to interpretive overload. A continent-wide emergency produces more signals than even a clever hidden network can sort cleanly. Thus, the Harpers during 1358 are at once admirable and unmistakably human. Shadowdale offers the clearest example. As Bane's influence presses upon the Dale and Gentilar aggression intensifies, Harpers are among those who help defend the region. The Battle of Swords Creek and the broader struggle around Shadowdale reveal what Harper power looks like under extreme strain. Not heavy battalions, not public sovereignty. Instead, warning, coordination, resistance, terrain knowledge, the ability to hold a place morally and logistically, even when a better-funded enemy arrives with the confidence of organized wickedness. Many Harpers die. This matters. The Harpers are often imagined, especially by critics, as a kind of inexhaustible cloud of meddlers. In truth, they pay heavily whenever history becomes overtly martial. They are resilient, not costless. Elminster's role in this year is, predictably, impossible to discuss without a little irritation from everyone involved. He is central because he is always central when Mystra, Shadowdale, and civilizational danger overlap. Yet even he does not stride through the time of troubles as some untouched wizard uncle above consequence. He is wounded by events, constrained by divine instability, and drawn into conflicts where even his formidable capabilities must submit to the larger crisis. Alongside him, the spectral Silune remains one of the more haunting proofs that Harper resistance is not reducible to the breathing. The dead assist the living. Old loyalties outlast ordinary embodiment. Shadowdale, like these hidden stacks, has always understood that memory can fight. One of the more revealing side theatres of the year involves the Malaugrim. Under cover of the time of troubles, these shape-changing infiltrators move against Faerûnian society with murderous ambition, and the attempt to kill Elminster folds into the larger confusion of the Gods' War. This is precisely the sort of thing a Harper network is built to contest. Not only armies, infiltration, replacement, the slow poisoning of trust. When the highest authorities are already in question, the danger posed by imposture grows exponentially. A world asking whether a god on the road is really a god is a world especially vulnerable to the quieter art of replacement by things wearing familiar faces. That the Harpers spend precious energy on such threats during 1358 tells you a great deal about the layered nature of the crisis. One can be fighting Banites in one valley while hunting false identities in another and trying to confirm divine rumor in a third. This is what real emergency work looks like. Untidy, contradictory, never as singular as epics pretend. The Harpers also illustrate how even good networks can err when interpretive conditions collapse. Storm Silverhand, in one remembered episode, stands among those who believe Adon and Midnight responsible for Elminster's apparent death and represents the prosecution in the ensuing trial. There is pathos in that. A Harper, one of the chosen, a figure of immense perception and loyalty, still reaches the wrong conclusion under pressure because the available evidence has been warped by catastrophe. If you want a healthy antidote to the notion that the Harpers are secretly omniscient shepherds of history, here it is. They are a network of intelligent, committed, often brave, often weary people navigating crises with incomplete information. Their virtue lies not in never erring, but in continuing to orient toward resistance against domination even when the field of truth becomes smoky. And that, I think, is why the Harpers survive the time of troubles, as an idea perhaps even more effectively than they survive it in flesh. A year like 1358 validates their underlying claim. Great concentrations of power can fail, thrones can become liabilities, temples can lose function, formal chains of command can freeze, lie, or collapse. In such conditions, decentralized moral resistance ceases to look romantic and starts to look infrastructural. The Harpers emerge bloodied but vindicated in one essential respect. A continent needs organizations capable of acting for the common good without waiting for permission from institutions already compromised. Of course, one must immediately add the caution. To say a network is necessary is not to say it is above criticism. The time of troubles also deepens the old Harper temptation to paternalism. If the world can tilt this violently, and if covert intervention truly can save lives, then one may begin excusing a very great deal of unseen interference in the name of prevention. There is no crisis so righteous that it cannot feed institutional vanity in its survivors. The Harpers are not immune. A hidden order that helps save the continent is apt to become more convinced than ever that it ought to decide quietly on behalf of others. History rewards them enough to strengthen the risk. Still, if you ask what the Harpers were doing while gods fell like meteors, the answer is clear. They were doing what decentralized, conscientious people always do when larger systems fail. defending crossroads, passing warnings, misjudging some things, dying for others, holding the line in places too small for the Grand Chronicles until the Grand Chronicles finally realized those places mattered. If the Harpers show how a borderless faction behaves when its ethic is resistance, the Gentarim show what happens when appetite, logistics, and tyranny are given a crisis dramatic enough to look like confirmation. The Black Network enters 1358 already mature. This is important. By the time of troubles, the Gentarim are not merely a sinister club with branding. They are a hardened interlocking machine of clergy, military force, mercantile ambition, magical assets, espionage, coercive trade, and the bleakly efficient political imagination that says every road is wasted until someone has monetized fear along it. Their patrons are multiple, but Bane's influence is central to the organization's culture. Tyranny, order through domination, disciplined expansion, the use of faith as force multiplier rather than consolation. These habits are benign in more than liturgical detail. So what happens when the Black Lord himself falls from heaven? For a brief and terrible moment, it looks like vindication. In Gentle Keep, Bane's descent onto the Black Altar is remembered as the arrival. Think of the psychological effect of that. Other faiths are reduced to rumor, pilgrimage, anxious searching, and dimmed miracle, while in one of the most aggressively militarized cities on the Moonsea, the patron power appears directly upon its own cultic center. Banites and Gentarim do not receive this as chastisement. They receive it, at least initially, as proximity. Their God is here. Their city matters. The line between divine will and organizational ambition grows frighteningly thin. This is one of the reasons the Gentarim are so dangerous in 1358. A decentralized tyranny can become more dangerous, not less, when metaphysical legitimacy localizes inside it. Bane, once on the ground, does not become humble. Imagine that. No, he uses what remains to him in the grammar most natural to his office: command, subordination, campaign. He orders Fazul, Chembril, and Sememon to cooperate despite their tensions, because a capable tyrant understands that rival servants may be made useful if the objective is large enough. Shadowdale again becomes a focal point. The twisted tower of Ashaba and Morning Dawn Hall matter not only symbolically, but strategically within the Avatar struggle. The Gentarim, already entangled there through their long war against the Dale, become extensions of their god's operational will. Observe the institutional lesson. The Harpers, in crisis, become more improvisational. The Gentarim, in crisis, become more doctrinally militarized. Their advantage is obvious. They already know how to mobilize under fear. They already possess troops, officers, supply chains, fortified centers, coercive revenue, and a culture that does not waste much time wondering whether ruthlessness has become unseemly. Their priests, commanders, and agents can pivot from one campaign to another without needing to invent the habits of obedience. When the world shakes, the Black Network can still issue orders. That alone gives it terrible resilience. But resilience is not the same as immunity. Because the Gentarim are so deeply tied to strong patrons and concentrated ambition, divine upheaval also exposes the fractures inside their coalition. Bane may be present, but his presence does not erase rivalry among his servants. Fzul's clerical authority, Sememun's strategic intelligence, mercantile concerns, military realities, and local self-interest all continue to tug at one another. The network functions, yes, but one should never confuse functionality with harmony. Organizations built on fear and advantage become especially brittle around succession, legitimacy, and patronal uncertainty. Everyone knows how to obey a strong lord. Fewer know how to interpret the silence or death of one. When Bane falls at Tantras, the shock to the Gentarim is therefore not merely devotional, it is constitutional. What is the Black Network when the Black Lord is dead? A childish answer would be finished. A historically literate answer is briefly disoriented, then adaptive. This is precisely why episode 18 had to come before tonight. The Gentarim survive leadership decapitation because by 1358 they are already more than a personal cult. They are a machine for converting instability into leverage. The death of Bane is devastating to faith, morale, and the symbolic cohesion of the whole enterprise. But the roads remain, the officers remain, the merchant arrangements remain. The need for armed escorts, black market goods, intimidation, and regional influence remains. Even their enemies remain, which is a kind of organizational glue more reliable than idealists admit. So the Black Network does what enduring factions do. It mutates. Many Gentarim shift their worship to Cyric after the time of troubles, because Cyric inherits much of the Dead Three's divine territory, and because opportunists are rarely sentimental for longer than a payroll cycle. Others remain attached to the memory or hidden legacy of Bane. Still others orient themselves toward Iyachtu Shvim as Banite continuity becomes more obscure and cultic. This is not doctrinal clarity. It is institutional survival under theological fragmentation. A kingdom might have broken outright under such a blow. The Gentarim, being a faction rather than a nation in the ordinary sense, simply distribute the wound and continue. That continuation is ugly, but instructive. It tells us that evil with infrastructure rarely dies when its patron does. It becomes deniable, franchised, and patient. The time of troubles also reveals how much the Gentarim rely on a particular social contract with fear. In uncertain times, many people will accept authoritarian protection, extortion masquerading as order, and coercive commerce that promises the roads will stay open if only one stops asking delicate moral questions. 1358 is ideal weather for that bargain. Priests are unsettled, kings are distracted, caravans are nervous, rumors multiply. In such conditions, the Gentarim can present themselves as the adults in the room, by which they mean the people most willing to weaponize stability for private dominance. Do not underestimate how attractive that can become. The ordinary villager does not always choose between virtue and villainy in clean fable colors. More often, he chooses between insecurity now and compromised safety at a known price. The Black Network understands this far better than most moralists. It feeds on the market value of fear. The time of troubles, by flooding the continent with fear, enlarges the market, and yet the year also checks them. Shadowdale resists, Harpers resist, Tantras becomes a grave for their god. The Black Network comes through the crisis not triumphant but educated. It learns that even direct divine embodiment is no guarantee against loss, and that future power will need to be more distributed, more adaptive, and more comfortable with mixed patronage than a simpler Banite confidence had assumed. Thus, 1358 helps create the later Gentarim as much as it wounds the earlier one. Not because the year improves them, because it teaches them how to survive Godfall. If you want the shortest summary of what the Gentarim were doing during the time of troubles, here it is. They were trying to turn revelation into command, then command into continuity. And when revelation died, they kept the books, reassigned the loyalties, and carried tyranny forward by other names. The Red Wizards of Thay present a different study in survival because they stand at an angle to the divine crisis. Do not misunderstand. Thay is not immune to the time of troubles. No serious arcane polity could be. Mystra's fall and the resulting instability of the weave touch every realm where spellcraft is infrastructure, and Thay is nothing, if not a country that has attempted to turn arcane talent into state architecture. Yet the Red Wizards are not, at their core, a priestly hierarchy suddenly bereft of their ordinary channel. They are a magocracy, cruel, learned, bureaucratic, slaving, expansionist, and habituated to regarding wizardly power as the proper organizing principle of public life. Such a state experiences divine upheaval differently. Its first instinct is not pilgrimage, it is assessment. Which neighbors are weakened more than we are? Which roots are exposed? Which divine monarchies have lost the very metaphysical terms by which they justified obedience? Which old hatreds can be resumed under cover of heavenly disorder? This does not make the Red Wizards calmer in a moral sense. It makes them colder. Remember what Thay is in this era. It is governed by Zulkirs, each terrible in the way specialists can become terrible when they stop mistaking breadth for necessity. It rests upon slavery, extraction, magical experiment, secret policing, and perpetual scheming. Its society is stratified not merely by wealth or lineage, but by the privileged status of arcane mastery. The Red Wizards do not see magic as one power among many. They see it as the credential most fit to rule. In peaceful times, that ideology makes them arrogant. In apocalyptic times, it makes them opportunists. And yet, the irony is rich. A magocracy that prides itself on discipline must now function, while magic itself becomes less predictably behaved. Arcane instability does not flatter the Red Wizards. It humiliates them professionally. Their reaction is therefore doubly revealing. They do not become humble. They become more managerial, more secretive, more determined to master what has become less cooperative. If later centuries remember Thay as a place where wizardly institutions persist through repeated disaster, 1358 is one of the years that taught them how. The Eastern theatres during the time of troubles also show how closely Thay's fortunes are tied to the fragility of the older Mulan empires around it. Mulhorand attempts to seize Alaor from Thay, and the effort founders amid storms and Sahuagin assaults in what becomes part of the Summer Storm's war. More than 30 ships are lost, and the dead number in the thousands. This is no trivial border inconvenience. It is a demonstration that when divine order falters, ancient rivals do not politely suspend strategy. They lunge. And sometimes the sea, which has always enjoyed humiliating strategic confidence, reminds them that crisis can compound. Mulhoran's divine and dynastic anxieties are already severe. Failed maritime aggression against Thayan holdings only makes the old empire look less inevitable. Alaor itself is instructive. Strategic islands, naval staging points, and peripheral holdings become newly significant when large systems destabilize. They understand this well. A continent in divine confusion is still a continent of sea lanes, granaries, ports, plateaus, and choke points. The Red Wizards do not cease being geographic thinkers simply because the gods have taken to walking. In some respects, the opposite is true. When metaphysical certainty weakens, hard control of roots and strongholds becomes more valuable. Then there is Chesenta, where the time of troubles acquires a particularly revealing Eastern flavor. Hor, moving through his own grim logic of vengeance, retrieves a cache of weapons from beneath Thaymount, while eluding the designs of a red wizard known as the Masked One. He arms Akanax, helps ignite wider civil war among the Chesentan cities, and the conflict eventually rolls outward into assault upon Untha and the Church of Raman. The details are as tangled as most inner-sea politics deserve to be, but the broader lesson is clear. Thay is not sealed. Its mountain heart, its magical reserves, its rivalries, and the schemes of its red-robed elites become entangled with divine movement and regional war. The time of troubles does not interrupt Eastern complexity. It accelerates it. What then are the Red Wizards doing during this year? They are first preserving their state. That sounds obvious. It is not. Preservation in Thay is not a passive act. It means maintaining the obedience of subordinates, the terror of slaves, the functionality of arcane institutions, and the rivalry of Zulkirs within non-terminal bounds. A slave empire under magical strain could fracture very quickly if its masters cease to appear formidable. So they labor to remain formidable. They are, second, reading weakness in others. Mulhoran's losses, Untha's instability, Chesenta's fractures, the continuing resistance of Rashemen and Aglarond in the wider regional picture. All of these matter to Thayan calculation. The Red Wizards need not solve every problem immediately. They need only record who is failing in what direction and which opportunities will still be ripe after the sky finishes judging itself. They are, third, learning a doctrinal lesson about power. The time of troubles demonstrates that openly divine states may be more brittle than states grounded in bureaucracy, coercion, and specialist elites. Mulhoran's divine monarchy is about to suffer a crisis of embodiment. Untha's immortal rulership is headed toward devastation. By contrast, Thay's rulers are not gods who have forgotten their duties. They are wizards who never pretended humility to begin with. There is a ghastly advantage in that. A regime founded upon explicitly secular cruelty is not embarrassed when heaven malfunctions. It simply adjusts. This is one reason the Red Wizards remain such durable antagonists in later Faerûn. They represent a form of organized power not destroyed by disillusionment with divine order. If anything, divine failure can strengthen their deepest argument. See, they may say, what comes of priest kings and sacred monarchies. Better the competent hand than the Holy One. Better the mage who knows than the god who strays. Better the disciplined elite than the sentimental kingdom waiting for miracles. It is a seductive lie because competence is real. And because competence without conscience so often sounds adult to the frightened. Still, let us not flatter they too much. Arcane instability hurts them. Rivalry hurts them. The same catastrophe that reveals their strengths also reinforces their pathologies. Paranoia, specialization without wisdom, contempt for ordinary lives, and the ever-present temptation to believe that a world of failing systems is simply begging to be ruled by those clever enough to exploit them. If the Harpers come out of 1358 more convinced of hidden guardianship, and the Gentarim more convinced of adaptable tyranny, the Red Wizards come out more convinced than ever that expertise should govern because everything else has proved embarrassing. That conviction will poison centuries, and because it is sometimes attached to real skill, it will keep finding buyers. No city can stand for all Faerûn during the time of troubles, but Waterdeep comes indecently close to auditioning for the role. That is partly because Waterdeep is always present where trade, rumor, magic, politics, and unwanted significance intersect. It is also because the city becomes one of the key western stages of the crisis. Midnight, Kelemvor's memory, Siric's treachery, Mirkul's assault, Kelban's intervention, Elminster's involvement, Blackstaff Tower, the Yawning Portal, the very practical business of hiding one of the tablets in a metropolis built over older darks. All of these make Waterdeep more than a backdrop. The city becomes an anatomical diagram of what the time of troubles does to urban civilization. Begin with fear. A city the size of Waterdeep runs on managed uncertainty even in ordinary years. Grain must arrive, ships must continue trusting the harbor, guilds must continue believing that coin paid now will still mean something next month. Temples, magistrates, noble houses, mercenaries, dock gangs, and ward-level reputations all weave together into a machine that most residents experience as simple normality. The time of troubles attacks precisely that hidden normality. Not by erasing the city in an afternoon, but by making every layer of assurance suspect. If gods can walk in the streets, then every street becomes narratively unstable. If divine magic fails, unless localized near an avatar, then temple districts cease to be uniformly dependable. If arcane power is fluctuating, then every ward and working once trusted to be routine acquires a question mark. A city can survive fear. What strains it is fear distributed unevenly across systems people thought were separate. Waterdeep's merchants feel this acutely. Warkeen's plight during and after the crisis turns commerce itself into a matter of metaphysical concern. The Lady of Trade is caught in divine catastrophe, and in the longer aftermath, her clergy find themselves grievously diminished, able to wield only the lower reaches of the magic they once enjoyed. That is not a decorative inconvenience. A mercantile world where the Church of Trade falters is a world in which contracts, credit, trust, and the psychology of exchange all shift subtly but pervasively. A shrewd merchant does not need to become a theologian to notice that divine backing has become unreliable. He only needs to observe which blessings fail, which auspices no longer reassure investors, and which temples now speak with strange vagueness about when full favor might resume. This is why I keep insisting that the time of troubles is a crisis of infrastructure. Not only belief. Commerce, especially in a port city, is half material and half confidence. Joaquin's entanglement therefore radiates outward through guild assumptions, warehouse decisions, maritime speculation, and the ordinary tempo of bargaining. How many quiet arguments in Waterdeep during 1358 ended not with doctrinal conclusion, but with someone saying in effect, "Very well, then we shall demand collateral." Quite a great many, I suspect. Then Mirkul comes through the lower darks, and the matter becomes less subtle. His emergence by way of the pool of loss beneath the yawning portal is one of those perfect realms images in which the city's civilized face and the abyss beneath it briefly cease pretending to be separate. Waterdeep is always a place of stacked realities, noble mansions above, inns and guild halls below them, and under all that the long throat into Undermountain, old caverns, forgotten cult spaces, secret passages, and whatever else the city's respectable folk prefer to call improbable when sober. For the Lord of Bones to enter the city through such a route is more than tactical. It is symbolically exact. Death does not politely arrive at the gatehouse. It rises through the architecture a city has learned to live above. Blackstaff Tower becomes the locus of defense and concealment, because of course it does. Kelban Aronson represents one of Waterdeep's enduring strategies for surviving impossible ages. Embed terrifying competence inside civic function and hope it remains at least intermittently answerable. During the time of troubles, he and his allies do what urban guardians always do when the impossible becomes local. They buy time, they concentrate knowledge. They attempt to keep one catastrophic object out of another catastrophic hand. No city survives by rhetoric alone. Eventually, someone in a tower full of books must make a plan, while the thing in the street still has teeth. When midnight destroys Mirkul over Waterdeep, the victory is magnificent and appalling in exactly the proportions the city deserves. A pestilent cloud drifts down. Life withers in its wake. Even triumph poisons blocks of the city. This is a nearly perfect emblem for urban endurance in the realms. Waterdeep survives, yes. It also pays. Survival is not the opposite of damage. One of the more fascinating aftershocks is the emergence of cultic awareness around Ao in Waterdeep and elsewhere. Mortals who have never before had much practical reason to think about the over-god now cannot avoid the fact that some higher adjudicator exists above the squabbling pantheon. It is an intellectual shock as much as a spiritual one. Priests had taught cosmology before. Now history has demonstrated hierarchy inside divinity itself. For some, this produces reverence. For others, resentment. For a few, it produces cultic enthusiasm of the sort always inspired when a previously abstract superior suddenly proves willing to intervene with enough force to reorder the universe. Waterdeep, being Waterdeep, responds by turning even metaphysical astonishment into social variety. There are those who become more devout, those who become more cynical, those who decide every prophecy is now negotiable, those who seek out sages, those who invest in locks rather than liturgy, those who flood taverns with new theories and none of the humility theory ought to require. The city does what great cities always do. metabolizes apocalypse into argument, business, reform, opportunism, memory, and gossip. And if that sounds irreverent, I assure you it is only accurate. Cities do not survive by maintaining a proper devotional pose. They survive by converting terror into routine faster than terror expects. Waterdeep learned that lesson again in 1358. The rest of Faerûn learned it by listening to Waterdeep talk about itself afterward. If you want to see the time of troubles strike at the deepest root of a people's political self-understanding, go east to the old empires. Mulhorand and Unther do not experience 1358 merely as another divine disturbance among many possible disturbances. Their histories are braided with manifest divinity in a manner most Faerûnian realms can only approximate. These are polities whose founding stories, governing structures, social hierarchies, and civilizational memory all look back through Immerskar to rescue, incarnation, sacred kingship, and the long aftermath of gods who did not merely receive worship from afar, but ruled, judged, warred, and embodied authority in forms the populace could point to. Episode 14 taught us how dangerous stolen peoples become when history refuses to let theft remain administrative. The Mulan were stolen across worlds, delivered by divine intervention, and then shaped into successor civilizations under gods who remained painfully politically near. That legacy produces splendor, continuity, monumental order. It also produces a terrible dependency. If sacred monarchy has been literal for centuries, what happens when literal divinity is forced to relocate, recombine, or die? The answer in 1358 is, everything old becomes suddenly provisional. Mulhorand first. Io's interventions during the time of troubles include the lifting of the barrier that had kept the manifestations of the Mulhorandi deities on Toril from simply rejoining their fuller divine essences. This matters enormously. The incarnations who had ruled, legitimized, and structured the realm are no longer bound in the same way. They depart that local condition. Mulhorand is forced abruptly to imagine itself without the old certainty of embodied divine rulership. For the first time in ages, the realm must reckon with the fact that a pharaoh can be, in the plainest sense, mortal. Do not treat that as merely a dynastic technicality. A truly mortal pharaoh is a revolution of expectation. Think of what this means from below. The peasant who has lived all his life under a sacred order, whose distance from humanity was part of its reassurance, must now ask different questions about law, tax, obedience, and failure. If a ruler is mortal, can he be wrong in a more ordinary way? If the divine presence is no longer physically enthroned as before, do priests gain or lose authority? Does legitimacy become more clerical, more bureaucratic, more military, or more precarious? The castes, temple structures, and habits of deference in Mulhorand do not evaporate, of course. Civilizations of that age do not dissolve in one judicial season. But the metaphysical confidence beneath them is cracked. Mulhorand survives partly because it is old enough to possess institutions beyond charisma. Priesthoods remain, scribal systems remain, agricultural organization remains, aristocratic and temple hierarchies remain. The realm has enough administrative muscle to keep breathing while its sacred logic is revised. That is not a small thing. Many societies flatter themselves that divine sanction is their foundation, when in truth, their true foundation is irrigation, grain accounting, tax collection, and the dull competence of people who know where the records are kept. Mulhorand rediscovers this under pressure. Yet survival is not serenity. The failed naval campaign against Thian Alaur during this same year underlines how strained and overextended the old empire has become. Storms, Sahuagin attacks, and losses at sea turn aggression into humiliation. The Summer Storm's War leaves Mulhorand dead by the thousands and its port cities harried. Crisis in Heaven does not spare the coast. The Empire's sacred self-image and strategic competence are both tested at once. Now, Unther. Unther, unlike Mulhorand, has for centuries been a harsher and more visibly decayed form of old divine kingship. Gilgeim's rule in the later era is infamous for cruelty, insecurity, and the political rot of a god who has mistaken endurance for right. Unther was once one of the great successors to divine rescue from Imaskar. By the 14th century DR, it is also one of the clearest cases in Faerûn of a sacred state continuing long after its sacredness has curdled into tyranny. This makes the time of troubles especially brutal there, because the crisis does not merely remove comforting illusions, it strips a despot of the metaphysical insulation beneath despotism. Gilgeim dies during the upheaval after catastrophic conflict tied to the wandering gods, Tiamat, and the devastation of Unthalas. Hoar also kills Raman, effectively ending the Untheric pantheon as a functioning order. Read that sentence slowly. An ancient pantheon is not merely embarrassed or displaced, it is ended. The sacred architecture of the realm collapses at the top. Priests lose their cosmic hierarchy. Nobles tied to divine bureaucracy lose their organizing fiction. Subjects long accustomed to surviving under a god-king must now survive the absence of one. It is tempting, especially for later moralizers, to greet this with satisfaction. Good, they say. Tyranny dies. The cruel god falls. Surely the people rejoice. Some do. Many also bleed. For ordinary Untherans, divine collapse does not arrive as a clean liberation package. It arrives amid devastation, war, invasion, factional struggle, and the terror that follows when long-hated authority disappears before civil order has learned to stand without it. Surviving nobles become fugitives. Old structures crack. Mulhorand, smelling historical and strategic opportunity with all the delicacy empires usually display in such moments, moves against much of Unther thereafter. The people are not handed freedom. They are handed transition under duress. This is why historians must distrust narratives of deserved collapse. A regime may deserve destruction. Its civilians seldom deserve the terms in which destruction arrives. The Mulan peoples across these eastern realms therefore experience the time of troubles as a kind of historical recursion. Once before, their fate had been entangled with divine intervention from beyond the ordinary world, with cosmic politics translated into human settlement. Now, again, their lives are remade because powers above the mortal scale alter the terms of presence, embodiment, and rule. One can imagine old scholars in Mulhorand and Unther feeling an especially bitter recognition. So, once more the heavens have opinions, and once more those opinions will be written in our taxes, our grain stores, our temples, our funerals, our military frontiers, and our family arrangements. The Eastern commoner thus learns a different version of the lesson the Sword Coast learns. Not merely that gods can fail, but that a society too thoroughly bound to manifest divinity may find its entire political vocabulary endangered when the gods change administrative form. And yet, the legacy does not vanish. Mulhorand and Unther remain legacy empires because history does not become irrelevant when its sacred center breaks. Law, architecture, agricultural regimes, liturgy, language, caste memory, monumental self-conception, all of these continue shaping later ages. The time of troubles does not erase the old empires, it forces them to continue in a world where divine immediacy is less stable, less innocent, and less capable of hiding the labor of institutions beneath it. In other words, the Mulan East is taught the same cruel lesson as the rest of Faerûn, but in a language older and sharper. A god-king may fall. A people still has to plant, a pantheon may shatter, someone still has to inventory the granary. And when divine rescue has once defined your civilization, every later divine correction feels uncomfortably like history reaching back through your blood to revise terms you were never asked to sign. The dwarves, as so often, make better students of catastrophe than most surface peoples. This is not because they are immune to grief. Dwarves grieve with geological force. It is because dwarven civilization has long practiced the difficult art of continuity under interrupted conditions. Collapsed tunnels, besieged holds, broken roads, dead kings, ancestral oaths surviving the flesh meant to keep them. These are not exotic categories to a people who have spent ages under mountain learning that endurance is not an emotion, but a system. So when the time of trouble strikes, dwarven communities suffer, certainly, but they are less surprised by the idea that divine favor and public order might not align perfectly in a given season. Even so, 1358 teaches them something new. Among the notable lasting effects of the crisis is a change in dwarven priestly practice. Long-standing restrictions that had kept dwarven divine office more sharply gendered begin to loosen. This might sound, to listeners addicted to large explosions and dead gods, like a footnote. It is not. It is one of the clearest examples of the time of troubles altering religious life, not only through spectacular deaths, but through institutional recalibration. When divine order is publicly tested, old procedural certainties become newly discussable. Communities re-evaluate who may serve, how service is understood, and whether inherited customs were cosmic necessities or merely old habits that happen to survive long enough to acquire stone-colored authority. Dwarves, being dwarves, do not make such changes lightly, which is why the change matters. They are not a people prone to revising sacred custom because the weather of fashion has shifted. If ritual structure moves among dwarves, it is because the event forcing the movement has been judged weighty enough to justify the tool marks. Then there is Mithril Hall. The attack launched in 1358 by the Drow and their allies from Menzoberranzan against the Hall is one of those splendid examples of how the time of troubles does not freeze ordinary enmities, but rather gives them new pressures, temptations, and chances for reconfiguration. While gods are wandering and dying above, while humans debate miracles and kings consult frantic clergy, The old war between deep and mountain continues in deadly earnest. Mithral Hall faces assault not only from drow, but from Goblinkin and allied Underdark forces, and its defense becomes a coalition affair. Dwarves receive aid from barbarians, Sverfneblin, folk of the Silver Marches, and powers including Illustrial and the Harpals. This, too, is a lesson in 1358. Catastrophe may be continent-wide, but it still arrives in local military forms, and survival belongs to those capable of alliance under pressure. For the dwarves of Mithral Hall, the time of troubles is not principally an abstract revelation about divine portfolio management. It is an army at the gate, a test of walls, command, kin loyalty, and whether old enemies from the deep can exploit a year when sacred assurance has grown unreliable above. That the hall survives says much about dwarven resilience, but also about a broader realm's truth. Practical coalitions often matter more than doctrinal clarity during civilizational stress. A besieged stronghold does not first ask whether all its allies interpret Ao correctly. It asks who will stand the wall at dawn. There is another dwarven angle worth noting, subtler but no less important. Dwarven theology, perhaps more than many human variants, has always been entangled with craft, ancestry, and proper place. The gods are not only distant receivers of praise, they are woven into smithwork, clan memory, funerary honor, mining, and the ethics of making and maintaining. A crisis that destabilizes divine accessibility therefore touches daily workmanship as much as temple ritual. What blessing still holds on the forge? What funeral prayers are safe? Which old protections of tunnel and vault remain dependable? In mountain realms and underholds, the time of troubles becomes a workshop question as much as a priestly one. And dwarves, bless their suspicious hearts, answer workshop questions by checking tools rather than declaiming. So while human cities argue, dwarven communities repair, test, pray again, revise where necessary, and keep lists. There is wisdom in that. Perhaps not grand wisdom. No bard will write a passionate lay called The Inventory of Emergency Rivets. But civilizations are preserved more often by that spirit than by prophecy. The dwarven lesson of 1358 is thus plain. When gods become unstable, keep the gates barred, the ledgers current, the rites examined, the alliances practical, and the hammers ready. It is not glamorous. It is why they endure. Now descend. One of the great errors surface chroniclers make when treating the time of troubles is to imagine it as chiefly a surface event with underground footnotes. This is a charming prejudice and entirely false. The Drow, perhaps more than any other great people of Faerûn, live within a political theology so direct and coercive that divine instability becomes immediately constitutional. In the great Lulthite cities, priestesses do not merely interpret sacred power. They wield it as a primary instrument of social order. House rank, punishment, war, legitimacy, fear, and ordinary civic terror are all entangled with the favor, or apparent favor, of the Spider Queen. What happens then when the heavens convulse? They do not become kinder, they become more dangerous. Menzoberranzan in 1358 provides the exemplary case. There, amid the broader turmoil, House Oblodra discovers that its psionic gifts remain effective in ways not wholly dependent on the same channels that trouble priestly magic. This is politically explosive. A society ordered under Lolthite priesthood is always vulnerable to alternative power systems, especially if those systems can function when divine channels flicker. House Oblodra senses opportunity. It plots to seize power in the city while more conventional sacred assurances are under strain. That is not merely a house coup. It is a constitutional experiment in miniature. Could a drow city founded on theocratic terror be reorganized, even briefly, around a different kind of superiority? The answer from House Baenre, backed by the eventual renewed ferocity of Lolthite order, is no. Ivanel Baenre and the ruling structure move decisively. House Oblodra is destroyed. The lesson is as brutal as everything else in drow history. If divine instability opens a crack, ambitious houses will rush it. If the patron power reasserts itself, that crack becomes a grave. Later memory often tells the story as though Lolth simply punishes disloyalty and order resumes. That is too simple. What actually matters is that the time of troubles reveals how contingent Lolthite political theology can feel from within when another power mode suddenly proves viable. Psionics does not replace priestcraft in Menzoberranzan, but for one dangerous interval, it demonstrates that the city's hierarchy is not synonymous with reality itself. This matters for the long history of drow politics. A theocracy fears heresy. It fears functional heresy most of all. The wider drow military action against Mithril Hall during this same year adds another dimension. Surface chroniclers sometimes mention the attack as if it were an isolated wartime exploit, one more dramatic battle in the long feud between dwarf and drow. Yet placed inside 1358, the campaign also shows how Underdark societies exploit surface distraction. When humans are staring at the heavens and temple networks are in disarray, older subterranean ambitions do not pause politely. They calculate. Menzoberranzan's strike against the dwarves belongs to that logic. The drow understand opportunity, and the time of troubles is one of the greatest opportunity fields the century offers. Still, the drow are not monolithic, though many surface elves and humans find it easier to speak as though they were. Eilistray's actions in this year are therefore crucial. She appears in the High Forest at Dark Maiden's Leap, rescuing drow refugees and guiding them towards safety at the promenade. Pause there. While the great Lolthite cities tighten violence, plot coups and prosecute war, another drow path is being enacted under divine crisis. Rescue, refuge, reorientation toward another future. Eilistray does not become less relevant because the loudest drow stories are crueler. She becomes more relevant precisely because divine upheaval exposes how badly alternatives are needed. This is part of what makes the time of troubles so revealing across peoples. It does not simply show what collapses, it shows what latent possibilities were waiting for collapse to expose them. In the surface imagination, drow during 1358 might seem to belong mostly to the familiar categories: raiders, priestesses, spiders, murder, one more subterranean threat taking advantage of general confusion. There is truth there as far as it goes. But history deserves more exactness. The year shows at least three drow realities at once. First, the Lulthite city as unstable theocracy, where shifts in divine accessibility can immediately produce lethal competition. Second, the militarized Underdark polity exploiting surface distraction for strategic gain. Third, the fragile alternative tradition associated with Eilistrae, in which divine presence does not intensify domination but offers escape from it. That is a far more interesting and far more useful map. It also reminds us that the time of troubles is not a simple morality play in which all peoples receive the same lesson from the same event. Drow society, because it has been shaped so deeply by direct divine coercion and house-based cruelty, experiences divine crisis as both danger and aperture. Some rush toward harsher consolidation, some rush toward opportunistic seizure, some flee, some are saved. Some discover, however briefly, that the regime they feared as total may in fact have seams. And because we are speaking of drow, one further note is necessary. The time of troubles does not make menzoberranzan rational. It does not teach moderation. It does not cure theological sadism. What it does is reveal the political anatomy already there. If priestly power falters, other modes compete. If Lolth reasserts, those modes are annihilated. If surface peoples are distracted, raids intensify. If refugees appear, Eilistrae gathers them when she can. Nothing is simplified, everything is clarified. That is often the best history can hope for, not redemption, exposure. And because Faerûn is too broad to be captured by 3 cities, 3 factions, and 2 legacy empires, let us sweep a little wider before the dust settles. In the seas and islands, the time of troubles is felt with particular cruelty, because maritime life is always a bargain with forces already too large for comfort. Umberlee's movements throw fleets into panic. The pirate isles suffer. Along the inner sea, divine disturbances ripple into waters already contested by Sahuagin, merchants, corsairs, and the underwater civilizations of Seros. Sailors are by profession skeptical and superstitious in equal measure, a combination well suited to survival and terrible for rumor control. When sea gods visibly move, that whole nervous system lights at once. Cargoes are delayed. Captains alter routes. Shrines crowd with offerings. Harbors become universities of panic. Lantan provides one of the year's stranger and more telling images. Gond washes ashore there in gnomish form and is sheltered by the Lantana. There is something almost tender in the scene, though one must be careful with that word around gods and inventors. What matters historically is not the quaintness, but the affinity. A people already devoted to craft, ingenuity, and device receive the god of craft not as abstraction, but as castaway and presence. The time of troubles repeatedly localizes divine relationship this way. Whole faiths suddenly become regional because their deity is bodily somewhere. To understand 1358, you must keep remembering this. Religion stops being evenly distributed. It acquires coordinates. Druids and forest peoples receive their own proof that even amid God's war, old landscapes remain politically alive. Malar prowls. Nobanian and Sylvanus are sighted. The Condlewood, the Gulthmere, the Winterwood, Iligon. These are not marginal scenes merely because they lie away from the famous urban route of the tablets. A world of gods in motion makes every sacred landscape tactically meaningful. Where a deity walks, hunts, blesses, or is repelled, becomes part of the year's geography of fear and hope. In the north, the clashes of Clangadin and Labalas on Ruatim remind us that even pantheons and peoples with very long memories can find themselves dragged bodily into the same crisis. Gods of battle, ancestry, and time do not merely symbolize old enmities. They can suddenly stand within them. There is something almost obscene about that level of intimacy between myth and place. Then again, obscenity is a regular feature of the time of troubles. The shadow thieves of Aeon offer another instructive side effect. The deaths linked to Baal and the broader divine convulsion gut, much of their assassin strength and force, extensive restructuring. Here again, we see that when a god falls, the damage does not end at the temple door. Whole criminal economies, patronage systems, and violence markets are thrown into disorder. Assassination is not only murder, it is a profession, a revenue stream, a network of clients and specialists. Remove the divine order beneath one of its patron powers, and the knife market changes shape. Even the weather seems to join the age's appetite for overstatement. Harsh winters, strange storms, and uncanny environmental events accumulate in the record. Wise historians are cautious here, for apocalyptic years tend to attract retrospective embroidery. Still, enough remains credible to say that many contemporaries experience the natural world itself as newly unreliable. Not every flood was divine. Not every strange wind was a god's sigh. Yet when the heavens are publicly unstable, nature is read politically. A storm is no longer only a storm. It is evidence. The world becomes overinterpreted. That may be the best short description of 1358 as lived experience. An overinterpreted world. Every unusual death becomes portent. Every wandering stranger becomes possible avatar. Every victory becomes omen. Every failure becomes theological argument. Faerûn at large during the time of troubles is thus not a continent waiting politely for the main plot. It is 1,000 local stories suddenly forced to read themselves inside cosmic litigation. Some villages are scarcely touched materially and transformed psychologically. Some cities are struck directly. Some peoples experience the year through military opportunity. Some through altered ritual. Some through shipping loss. Some through refugees. Some through the simple, unbearable fact that the sky can no longer be taken for granted as a stable administration. In a setting like the realms, that is enough to change everything. Now let us return to Ao, because no understanding of the time of troubles is sufficient if Ao is left as a gigantic hand descending from beyond the frame to punish everyone and then vanish again into theological fog. Mortals dislike custodians. We prefer heroes, tyrants, saints, monsters, loving fathers, betrayed kings, tragic mothers, and elegant villains. Even our metaphysics tends to be autobiographical. We keep trying to read the highest powers as enlarged versions of roles we already know how to admire or resent. Ao resists this by being, above all, structural. He is not the warm center of a devotional life. He is not the god to whom peasants ordinarily pray for rain or sailors for safe harbor. He is the superior orderer, the one who measures whether the lower offices are being held according to their charge. That sounds abstract until something breaks badly enough to require it. Then it sounds terrifying. The time of troubles is the principal historical proof that Ao is not merely a distant theory. He acts when the pantheon has ceased to behave as a trustworthy steward of the world below it. The theft of the tablets is the formal trigger, yes, but the sources are quite clear that Ao's anger encompasses more than the theft itself. The gods have been negligent toward their faithful and habitually preoccupied with power. The crisis is thus as much ethical audit as property dispute. The tablets matter because they are constitutional objects. The judgment matters because office holders have forgotten office. This is why I call Ao's mode custodian and judge. A custodian because he keeps the larger order from dissolving into divine self-indulgence. A judge because when that order is violated, his response is not advisory. Note the sequence. He does not simply retrieve the tablets personally at once. He forces the gods into conditions that expose them to embodiment, limitation, consequence, and dependence on ground they usually use only as a devotional resource. He makes them walk among the mortals they had neglected. He leaves Helm at the gate because somebody must still keep procedure. And when the tablets are finally returned, he does not reward the old system with restoration. He destroys the tablets and redistributes portfolios under a new arrangement. That is not nostalgia. It is sentence. Many mortals recoil from this because it feels impersonal. Indeed it is. But impersonality is not always indifference. An archivist who corrects a false record without asking whether the liar had complex feelings is not indifferent to truth. He is serving it. Ao's relationship to order may be something like that at the cosmic scale. He is not there to flatter divine personalities. He is there to preserve the functioning of the whole. From one undead custodian to another, I confess a degree of professional recognition. Do not mistake that for affection. There is also a subtler and more disturbing lesson in Ao's conduct. He treats divine portfolios as offices to be reassigned according to necessity, fitness, and judgment, rather than as natural extensions of personal identity. Mortals often speak of gods as though the god and the function were indistinguishable forever. Ao's actions say otherwise. Magic must have a steward. Death must have a steward. Murder, strife, tyranny, lies, trade, joy, and all the rest are not merely human concepts, but operative domains requiring governance in the realm's cosmological order. If one holder fails or falls, another may be appointed. This makes divinity in Faerûn both more terrifying and less romantic. More terrifying because the offices are real and the world needs them. Less romantic because no god may safely assume the office is theirs by personal charm alone. Power, in this model, is fiduciary. There are kings in Faerûn who would benefit from hearing that word until it bruised. Ao also clarifies the role of duty through Helm. Few episodes in Realm's history divide sympathies so sharply as Helm's slaying of Mystra at the Celestial Stair. To many he is cruel, to others magnificent in obedience. Both reactions miss something if held alone. The point is not that Helm is secretly right in a way that painlessly resolves the tragedy, nor that he is merely a brute instrument. The point is that Ao's order requires at least one god willing to keep the gate even when every sentimental instinct in the audience wants the gate opened. A cosmos without procedure invites exactly the sort of self-authorizing exceptions that caused the crisis. Helm becomes hated because procedure always looks heartless at the precise moment someone exceptional wants exemption. Again, archives know the feeling, and yet AO is not simply a machine. The post-crisis arrangement shows discernment rather than mere automatic reset. Torm is restored. Midnight is elevated to Maestra's office. Cyric, disastrously, is also elevated. Proof that AO's judgment is not a reward ceremony for moral favorites, but a settlement made within the realities of what has occurred. The results are not meant to comfort. They are meant to resume function under new terms. That some of those terms prove themselves unstable later is not evidence that the crisis lacked meaning. It is evidence that no settlement in Faerûn remains uncontested for long. This, I suspect, is the final reason AO unsettles so many later thinkers. He reveals that the universe of the realms is governed neither by pure sentiment nor by democratic reassurance. It is governed by ordered offices, duties, failures, punishments, and reappointments. In other words, like every truly dangerous institution, only larger. So when later priests invoke AO, or cults form around his name, or philosophers speak of him in tones that blend reverence with unease, they are responding not just to power, but to a model of oversight. The gods themselves answer upward. They too can be judged. There is no more effective solvent for simple piety than that fact, and no stronger support for sober religious seriousness. The time of troubles does not teach that the gods are unreal. It teaches that even the gods are accountable. And that may be the most radical theological statement Faerûn ever had forced upon it. We come then to the most dangerous moral misunderstanding of the time of troubles. Mortals rise. And because they rise, generations of fools thereafter tell themselves the story is somehow encouraging. It is not. Or rather, it is encouraging only in the same way a palace fire may encourage a clever thief who has always wondered whether the crown room is usually left unattended during evacuation. Opportunity exists. That does not make the event uplifting. Cyric is the first and most obvious warning. Everything about his ascent should have immunized later centuries against the worship of naked opportunism. Yet later centuries are incorrigible. Before divinity, Cyric is not a hidden saint, not a misunderstood reformer, not a noble rebel awaiting recognition. He is petty, bitter, cruel, ambitious, and acutely attentive to openings in other people's trust. He betrays companions. He flatters when useful. He covets office before he understands it. He kills Baal with God's bane and comes through the crisis laden with portfolios he has done nothing morally to deserve. AO's redistribution places immense power in hands that have proved only their capacity for survival and violence under instability. This is not a celebration of merit. It is an indictment of chaos. A world that can produce Cyric as beneficiary of divine crisis is a world warning you that structures matter because when structures fail, the nearest ruthless thing may inherit the machinery. I do not know how to say that more plainly. Cyric is not the inspirational face of mortal possibility. He is the cautionary emblem of under-regulated succession. And because he is clever enough to weaponize grievance, paranoia, and grievance masquerading as revelation, his later career only deepens the warning. He becomes proof that apotheosis does not purify character. Office magnifies it. Now, Midnight. Here the matter grows more difficult, because Midnight is indeed vastly more admirable than Cyric. She labors, suffers, carries burdens not of her making, resists where resistance is costly, and finally inherits Mystra's office under circumstances in which some steward of magic is desperately required. If Cyric is the bad outcome, Midnight is the best available one. Yet even here I urge caution. Her story is not simply good person rises, therefore catastrophe finds worthy successors. It is instead a harsher and more instructive truth. In emergency, sometimes the least disastrous candidate is still chosen through trauma, impossible burden, and a transfer so immense that the person who rises cannot remain merely the person who began the road. When Midnight becomes the new Mystra, continuity is preserved, yes. Magic has a steward again. The world is spared deeper ruin, but nobody should mistake that for an uncomplicated personal triumph. To become a god in the realms is not merely to receive promotion. It is to be altered by portfolio, office, cosmic expectation, worship, and the new relation between self and function. The very lesson Ao teaches, that offices are larger than holders, means that every mortal apotheosis carries a cost in personhood. Midnight survives the warning better than Cyric. She does not escape it. This is one reason the time of troubles remains such an inexhaustible source of later unease. It shows that divinity in Faerûn is not only a matter of ancient beings beyond mortal reach. It can be an emergency appointment, a vacancy, a transfer, a terrifying act of continuity under duress. That should make every thoughtful believer both more hopeful and more afraid. Finder Wyvernspur offers a subtler version of the same principle. Through the wreckage left by Moanda, he absorbs and reshapes a portfolio into something new, turning rot towards cycles of life. It is tempting to read this as proof that mortality can redeem fallen divine terrain. Perhaps. Yet even here the essential lesson remains. Catastrophe opens offices. Someone will occupy the space. Whether that occupant sanctifies, stabilizes, deforms, or further corrupts what they inherit depends on character, circumstance, and the surviving architecture around them. The Red Knight's rise, associated in this era with mortal roots and later divine station, presses the point further. Strategy itself, the disciplined rationality of war, acquires divine expression through a path that later memory connects back into the broader upheavals of 1358. Again, the realms seem to say that functions do not vanish merely because old holders do. They seek new governance. If old pantheons crack, concepts are not left ownerless for long. This is wondrous. It is also alarming. A civilization that knows office can pass upward from below is a civilization that must think much harder about what sorts of mortals it cultivates, rewards, and allows near levers of consequence. And then there is Kelemvor, not yet Lord of the Dead during 1358, but already marked by the age's grim arithmetic. Betrayed, killed, drawn toward a later settlement of Death's office, he stands as a reminder that the time of troubles does not finish all its appointments in the year itself. Some consequences ripen later. A divine vacancy opened in crisis may require another decade to settle into a more bearable shape. Even death itself needs administrative repair after the chaos of Mirkul and Cyric. If you listen carefully, the whole episode is asking one unignorable political question. What kind of person do you want waiting nearest the broken mechanism? Most societies, if they are honest, answer badly. They cultivate the ambitious, the eloquent, the ruthless, the well-connected, the theatrically confident, and the technically capable, then act shocked when crisis promotes exactly those traits upward. Cyric is what happens when a civilization confuses survivorship with merit. Midnight is what happens when decency, talent, and endurance somehow remain close enough to the mechanism to save what can still be saved. Both are products of 1358. Both are warnings, though of different kinds. Cyric warns that emergency succession rewards the unscrupulous if structures fail badly enough. Midnight warns that even good succession exacts an unbearable cost from those asked to hold the world together afterward. Taken together, they form perhaps the sharpest lesson the time of troubles can offer later ages. Do not wait for collapse to ask who is fit to inherit. Ask before the sky cracks. Ask while the offices are still occupied, the ledgers still current, the roads still passable, the gods still comfortably distant, and the clever men in every city are still claiming there will always be time later to think about succession seriously. History, with its usual malice, rarely grants that leisure twice. What then does 1358 leave behind besides graves, rearranged portfolios, and a generation with excellent reasons to distrust confident sermons? Quite a lot. Dead magic and wild magic zones remain as wounds and reminders. Priests across the continent carry revised assumptions about how dependent they are on channels they do not govern. Temples become more cautious, or at least the wiser ones do. Some churches turn inward, strengthening doctrine in compensation for shock. Others become more political because shaken legitimacy seeks visible control. Merchant faiths never look quite the same again. Joaquin's long impairment teaches the market what it means when a portfolio central to daily life is temporarily absent from full power. Helm's reputation is scarred in whole regions because duty without tenderness is difficult to forgive from below. Ao becomes newly thinkable. The over-god moves from philosophical upper shelf to grim historical fact. The old empires of the East learn that manifest divinity is no guarantee of stable succession. The Gentirim learn that a faction can survive even the death of its patron if its logistics are broad enough and its moral standards low enough. The Harpers learn that decentralized conscience is not a romantic hobby, but a genuine civilizational necessity when higher orders fail. The Red Wizards learn that bureaucratized expertise can look especially seductive after sacred monarchies humiliate themselves. Dwarves learn again that continuity belongs to those who maintain practice under duress rather than waiting for grand reassurance. Drow houses learn that any interruption in divine regularity will be exploited immediately by rival power systems, and that theocracy survives not by being natural, but by crushing alternatives faster than they can institutionalize. Waterdeep learns that no city, however worldly, is above becoming a stage for divine settlement. Mulhorand and Unther learn that sacred kingship, once literal, can still become administratively obsolete in a single age. And ordinary people across Faerûn learn that the distance between mortal and divine is not as secure as temple murals once implied. That last lesson may be the most destabilizing of all. Because once mortals know gods can die, office can transfer, and ambitious opportunists can rise, religion itself changes tenor. It becomes harder to speak of divine ranks with the old, untroubled timelessness. The gods are still gods, certainly, but history has gotten inside theology. Worship can no longer pretend to float above event. Every priest, after 1358 ministers, in a world where congregants know that portfolios may change hands, and that some of the current powers were once recent solutions to recent disasters. This gives later Faerûn its peculiar mixture of fervor and skepticism. The people of the realms remain intensely religious. How could they not? Their world offers too much evidence. But their religiosity is less innocent than it would otherwise have been. Gods are not mere abstractions. They are offices with case history. Faith becomes entangled with precedent. Sages, adventurers, rulers, and commoners alike live in the shadow of known divine turnover. That is why prophecies, cult revivals, dead god rumors, and stories of possible return or replacement carry such political voltage in later centuries. The precedent exists. 1358 made certain forms of the incredible administratively imaginable. Even later, world-shaping revisions to the realm's apparent order must be understood partly through the doorway 1358 opened. Once the realms has endured a year in which cosmic order publicly rewrites itself, later upheavals become easier to narrate without insulting the setting's credibility. The Time of Troubles teaches Faerûn how to survive ontological revision by turning it into history instead of contradiction. That will matter very much next time. For now, note also the narrative consequence for adventuring itself. The realms, after 1358, is richer in ruined shrines, contested portfolios, schismatic cults, post-crisis relic trails, and geographically grounded divine memory. It is a setting where any old battlefield may have been fought not merely by kings, but by avatars. Any temple may hold a doctrine sharpened by emergency. Any faction may cite the Gods' War as proof of its own necessity. This is one reason the Time of Troubles keeps returning as background pressure in later campaigns and stories. It is not only famous, it is generative. It creates social conditions from which countless later plots naturally grow. And because we began tonight by asking what happened to factions and peoples during the year, let us end this portion by naming the largest answer. They were audited, not all by Ao directly, some by circumstance, some by exposure, some by the simple removal of assumptions they had never realized were load-bearing. A faction discovered whether it could function without patronal certainty. A people discovered whether its identity depended too heavily on divine embodiment. A city discovered how much of its confidence was ritualized habit. A priesthood discovered whether service meant office or merely access. An ambitious mortal discovered that the road upward was shorter than ethics had promised. Audit is not a glamorous word. It is, however, the correct one. The Time of Troubles is Faerûn's great audit of divine and institutional dependency. And, as with most audits, the shame belongs less to the discovery than to the prior habits that made discovery necessary. So before we close the folio tonight, I leave you, as ever, not with conclusions polished smooth enough for shelf display, but with questions worth carrying into the dark. What sort of world is safer? One in which the gods are distant and often silent, or one in which they may suddenly appear in person and turn whole cities into arguments? When a crisis reveals that even divine office is transferable, does that make you feel more hopeful about justice or more afraid of succession? Which institution during the time of troubles do you judge most harshly? The gods who forgot their duties, the factions that exploited the chaos, the priesthoods that improvised certainty they no longer possessed, or the ordinary mortals who followed the loudest claimant because fear had made subtlety unaffordable? What would have frightened you most in 1358? Not the great answer one gives to sound impressive, the true one. The loss of healing in your district temple, the rumor that a god had been seen on the North Road, the market seizing because contracts were no longer trusted, the thought that your ruler's sacred mandate had just become historically negotiable, the possibility that some ambitious little knife of a person might climb into divinity while better souls died holding the line. And one question more, because the candles are patient and history dislikes being dismissed with abstractions. If the highest offices in a civilization suddenly failed, who around you would be nearest the broken mechanism? Who would try to repair it? Who would try to own it? Who would insist nothing fundamental had happened and ask everyone to continue as before? The time of troubles is over in the calendar. It is not over in the political imagination of the realms. Sit with that. Next time we move forward into another pair of world-breaking transitions, the Spell Plague and the Second Sundering. We will ask how the realms survives periods when reality itself seems to revise its operating terms. We will speak of blue fire, divine death, a bear's return, worlds and maps seeming to lurch under their own metaphysics, and the long labor by which the setting becomes once more recognizably itself without ever truly becoming simple again. We will ask how one narrates such changes in-world without insulting memory, and why the post-Sundering age feels less like peace than like breathing space purchased after too many near drownings. That, however, is for another night. For now, remember that taleofthelich.com is live. The timelines are gathering there. The transcripts are gathering there. The connective tissue between these ages is gathering there as well, because no year in Faerûn stands alone, and certainly not 1358. If tonight has left you wanting the larger skeleton beneath the Gods' War, the old empires behind it, the factions moving through it, the later upheavals that answer it, go to taleofthelich.com. Merch is coming soon too. I remain deeply amused that meditations on divine constitutional crisis, opportunistic apotheosis, and the market consequences of absent trade goddesses may soon become apparel and household objects. Still, if some future garment or mug prompts a passerby to ask why it is unwise to assume the person nearest a vacancy is the person best suited to inherit it, I shall count that as educational outreach of a surprisingly modern kind. This episode was brought to you by Dharma Web Solutions. If you need a site built with foresight, systems designed to remain intelligible under stress, or technical work done by people who understand that maintenance is not the enemy of ambition, but the discipline that prevents ambition from collapsing into embarrassment, visit dharmawebsolutions.com. And if this tale served you, leave a rating or review. Careful memory does not preserve itself merely by deserving to. It survives because enough people decide to support it before louder, thinner, more convenient versions of the past harden into common sense. Until next time, my apprentice. Trim the wick, but do not trust the calm that follows. Keep an eye on every office that claims permanence. Be suspicious of every opportunist who calls collapse an opening. And if ever, on some lonely road between shrine and city, you hear that a god has been seen ahead, and that all you must do is hurry, kneel, and surrender your judgment, because history itself is passing by in embodied form. Remember this night in the archive. Remember the broken scale. Remember that even heaven may require audit. And remember that the difference between ruin and forgetting is often nothing more glamorous than one mind, one ledger, one witness, one stubborn keeper refusing to let catastrophe become mythology before its evidence has cooled. Good night. May your faith be disciplined, your questions exact, your institutions load-bearing, your loyalties resistant to spectacle, and your hands far from any ladder built of panic, corpses, and vacancy that promises to carry you upward too quickly.